He told me I needed more therapy. After I reported him for targeting survivors of Smiled and said, "Takes one to know one, right?" When I tried to walk away, he stepped closer and whispered, "I'll ruin you before this even starts." I just stared at him. That was 3 months ago. Yesterday, he watched me testify from the defense table without saying a word. I was 6 months into my job at a private therapy clinic when I noticed something off about Dr. Buster. He was getting these personal texts during sessions that made him smile in this weird way. I caught a glimpse of his phone once when he left it on the counter and saw an intimate photo from someone saved as Kelsey B. I recognized her from the waiting room. She was one of his regular patients. Buster scheduled certain female patients only for late evening appointments. Always called them emergency sessions. The clinic was usually empty by then, except for him and whoever he was seeing. I told myself I was being paranoid. Buster had been practicing for 15 years and everyone loved him. Published in all the major journals, ran workshops on trauma therapy. The other therapists practically worshipped him. Then I accidentally got one of his patient files in my box. Kelsey M. had borderline personality disorder and severe abandonment trauma from childhood. Her file showed she'd been seeing him twice a week for 8 months. That seemed excessive for someone who should have been making progress by now. A week later, I heard Kelsey crying in the bathroom. She kept saying, "I'm not special to him anymore," over and over. When she came out, her eyes were red and puffy. She saw me and just ran out of the building. Another patient named Jennifer switched to my caseload suddenly. During intake, she mentioned she'd been seeing another therapist at our clinic but wanted a change. When I asked why, she got really quiet and said there were uncomfortable dynamics but wouldn't elaborate. I noticed she tensed up whenever someone mentioned Dr. Buster. I started paying more attention after that. Found some weird billing patterns when I was doing paperwork late one night. Buster was charging insurance for 2-hour intensive therapy sessions, but building security logs showed him leaving 3 or 4 hours after those patients arrived. Everything exploded during my 3rd session with Jennifer. She broke down completely and told me Buster had initiated a physical relationship with her while treating her for intimate assault trauma. She showed me text messages where he threatened to have her involuntarily committed if she told anyone. One message said, "Who would believe a woman with your diagnosis over me?" Jennifer was pregnant. Buster was pressuring her to get a termination of pregnancy and offering to pay for it through some bogus therapy scholarship fund. She was terrified and didn't know what to do. I spent that night going through patient files and schedule patterns. Buster specifically targeted women with histories of intimacy trauma and personality disorders, women with no family support systems, women who could be easily discredited if they spoke up. I realized my own patient Rachel, who was recovering from marital rope, had been pulled into consultations with him recently. I went to our clinic director, Dr. Patricia Chen, the next morning. She'd been Buster's mentor and was godmother to his children. I laid out everything I'd discovered, expecting her to be horrified. Instead, she laughed. Actually laughed. These troubled women often develop fantasies about their therapists. It's called transference. You should know this. She told me Jennifer had previously accused her stepfather of abuse, which was never proven, and suggested I was too inexperienced to recognize when patients were lying. Buster confronted me in the parking lot that afternoon. The nice guy mask was completely gone. I've been published in every major journal. You're nobody. If you keep this up, I'll destroy your career before it even starts. He knew about my own therapy history from when I was getting licensed. Takes one to know one, right? Maybe you're projecting. Maybe you need more therapy yourself. My supervisor pulled me aside the next day and warned me to drop everything or face termination for violating colleague confidentiality. The whole clinic was protecting him. That night, Rachel attempted sewer slide. Buster had told her during their consultation that she was too damaged for real love, and it had sent her spiraling. She survived, but barely. Jennifer lost the baby a week later. She said Buster had made her special tea during an emergency session, and she'd felt weird after drinking it. Security footage showed him disposing of medical waste that night, but Chen refused to review it. I found Buster's hidden files in an old storage room. 11 victims over 8 years with detailed notes about their vulnerabilities and how to exploit them. Kelsey M. wasn't the first pregnancy. Another patient had moved away suddenly 2 years ago after a similar situation. I was suspended the next week after Buster planted substances in my desk and reported me for substance abuse affecting patient care. All my patients got reassigned to him. Jennifer texted me that she was going to end it and couldn't live with the trauma and loss. That's when I knew I had to go outside the clinic. I contacted the state licensing board directly with all the evidence I'd gathered. Recorded Jennifer's testimony before she made an attempt that thankfully failed. She's still hospitalized but alive. The investigation is ongoing now, but 3 more former patients have already come forward after seeing the news coverage. The clinic is under review and Buster was arrested last week at his daughter's dance recital of all places. I'm blacklisted from the local therapy community, but Jennifer called yesterday. She's getting stronger. Said she wants to help other victims when she gets out, but she also knows Dr. Buster has connections, and we both doubt he's going down so easily. The state board investigator called me at 6 in the morning. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand, still half asleep, and heard a woman's voice asking if I could meet her downtown in an hour. She wouldn't give details over the phone, but said it was urgent. I threw on clothes and drove through empty streets, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. The investigator met me at a coffee shop near the government building. She was younger than I expected, maybe early 30s, with tired eyes and a stack of folders that she kept glancing at nervously. She slid a paper across the table. A cease and desist letter from Buster's attorney. The letterhead was from one of the most expensive firms in the city. They were threatening to sue me for defamation, tortious interference, and violation of patient confidentiality. The dollar amount they were seeking made my stomach drop. The investigator explained that Buster had hired this firm immediately after his arrest. They were already working to get the charges dropped, claiming I had fabricated evidence and manipulated vulnerable patients into making false accusations. She showed me statements from Dr. Chen and 3 other therapists at the clinic, all saying I had exhibited unstable behavior and had a personal vendetta against Buster. My phone buzzed. A text from my landlord saying my lease wouldn't be renewed next month. No explanation given. I knew Buster's reach extended far, but I hadn't expected it to happen this fast. The investigator asked if I had somewhere safe to stay. She explained that in cases like this, the accused often escalated their behavior. She'd seen it before with other healthcare professionals under investigation. They got desperate, dangerous. She suggested I vary my routine, stay with friends, keep my phone charged. I left the meeting and went straight to the bank to check my accounts. My savings were already depleted from the legal consultation I'd needed after the suspension. The lawyer had told me defending against Buster's lawsuit would cost at least $50,000. Money I didn't have. Jennifer called from the hospital that afternoon. Her voice was barely a whisper. Someone had sent flowers to her room with a card that said, "Get well soon. Some stories are better left untold. The handwriting wasn't signed, but she recognized it. It was the same as the notes Buster used to leave on her car windshield during their relationship. Hospital security reviewed their footage, but the delivery person had worn a baseball cap pulled low. Jennifer was terrified. She asked if she should withdraw her statement, said maybe it wasn't worth it. Maybe she should just focus on getting better and forget everything. I spent 20 minutes convincing her to stay strong, but I could hear the fear in her voice. She'd already been through so much. The miscarriage, the sewers light attempt, and now this. I promised her we'd get through it together, even though I wasn't sure how. That evening, I discovered my professional liability insurance had been canceled. The company claimed I'd violated terms by engaging in behavior that exposed them to claims. Without insurance, no clinic would hire me. My supervisor at the suspended job had already spread word through the local therapy network that I was unstable and unethical. I started applying for jobs outside my field just to pay bills. Retail, food service, anything. But even those applications seemed to disappear into the void. One manager at a bookstore told me off the record that they'd received a call warning them about my history of making false accusations. The state board investigator called again 3 days later. The investigation was being slowed by procedural challenges. Buster's lawyers had filed motions requiring extensive documentation and challenging the board's jurisdiction. She said these tactics could drag the process out for months, maybe years. Meanwhile, 2 of the victims who'd initially come forward were wavering. One had received a settlement offer through her homeowner's insurance company, claiming damage to her property that coincidentally matched the amount she owed in student loans. The other had gotten a promotion at work that required her to relocate immediately. I started sleeping on different friends' couches each night. I'm curious why Dr. Chen laughed when presented with such serious evidence. That reaction seems oddly defensive for someone who should be concerned about patient safety. Makes me wonder what she's protecting besides just her mentor's reputation. My car developed mysterious mechanical problems that my mechanic said looked like deliberate damage. Someone had poured something into the gas tank. The repair would cost more than the car was worth. Rachel, my former patient who'd attempted sewer slide, reached out through a mutual acquaintance. She wanted to help but was terrified. Her ex-husband had suddenly become cooperative in their divorce proceedings, offering her everything she wanted if she'd sign a broad non-disclosure agreement that would prevent her from testifying in any proceedings. I met with her at a park, both of us looking over our shoulders. She showed me text messages she'd saved from her sessions with Buster. Messages where he'd told her she was special, that their connection transcended the typical therapeutic relationship. Messages that proved everything I'd been saying, but she was scared to come forward officially. She had 2 kids. She needed the divorce settlement to start over. I couldn't blame her. We all had to survive somehow. The clinic where I'd worked was still operating normally. Dr. Chen had sent an email to all patients explaining that there had been unfounded allegations and that Dr. Buster was taking a brief sabbatical but would return soon. Several patients had already been reassigned to him for when he came back. I kept all my evidence in multiple locations now. Cloud storage, physical copies with trusted friends, USB drives hidden in various places. I'd learned from other whistleblower stories that evidence had a way of disappearing when powerful people felt threatened. My former colleagues avoided me completely. One crossed the street when she saw me coming. Another blocked me on all social media. The professional community I'd worked so hard to join had excised me like a tumor. Late one night, someone knocked on the door of the friend's apartment where I was staying. We didn't answer. The knocking continued for 10 minutes, then stopped. In the morning, we found a manila envelope tucked under the door. Inside were photos of me taken from a distance over the past week. At the coffee shop, at the park with Rachel, leaving the bank. Each photo had a timestamp. Someone was watching, documenting, building their own file. The state board investigator said this was intimidation, but not technically illegal. Unless they made explicit threats, there wasn't much law enforcement could do. She suggested I document everything, keep a detailed log of incidents, build my own counterfile. Jennifer's discharge date was approaching, and she had nowhere safe to go. Her family had sided with Buster after his lawyers contacted them, suggesting their daughter was having another mental health crisis. They wanted her to sign papers for a longer-term psychiatric hold. I spent hours on the phone with patient advocacy groups, trying to find resources for her. Most were overwhelmed or underfunded. One advocate told me bluntly that cases against prominent medical professionals rarely went anywhere. The system protected its own, but I kept pushing forward. What else could I do? Every time I wanted to give up, I thought about Kelsey, about the 11 victims in those hidden files, about the ones who might come after if Buster returned to practice. The investigation crawled forward despite every obstacle. More witnesses meant more evidence, even if some were too scared to testify officially. The state board had to follow procedures, had to document everything properly. Buster's lawyers could slow things down, but they couldn't stop them entirely. I learned to live with the constant anxiety, the looking over my shoulder, the financial pressure. This was what fighting back looked like. Not dramatic confrontations or sudden victories, but a slow grind through systems designed to protect the powerful. 3 weeks after his arrest, Buster was released on bail. His colleagues had pooled money for his defense fund. He was photographed leaving the courthouse in a suit, looking confident. The local therapy association released a statement about presumption of innocence and the danger of rush to judgment. That night, I sat in my borrowed room, looking at my dwindling bank balance and the stack of job rejections. But I also looked at the messages from Jennifer, getting stronger every day. From Rachel, who decided to testify despite the cost. From 2 new victims who'd reached out after hearing through word of mouth what was happening. This was far from over. Buster had money, connections, and a system that defaulted to protecting him, but we had something else. Truth, persistence, each other. The real fight was just beginning. The investigator called me again at dawn the following morning. Her voice sounded strained as she explained that someone had broken into her office overnight. Nothing stolen, but files had been disturbed. The security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during those exact hours. I drove to meet her at a different location this time, a busy diner on the outskirts of town. She looked exhausted, dark circles under her eyes. She pushed a folder across the table containing photocopies of documents she'd managed to secure before the break-in. Bank records showing suspicious transfers from the clinic's accounts to offshore holdings. Payment authorizations with Dr. Chen's signature for services that didn't match any legitimate vendors. The investigator explained that Buster's legal team had filed an emergency motion to seal all evidence related to the case, citing patient privacy concerns. If granted, it would prevent any of the victims' testimonies from being used publicly. The hearing was scheduled for next week. My phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number, a photo of Jennifer leaving the hospital for a therapy appointment. The message read simply that accidents happen to unstable people. I showed it to the investigator, who documented it but warned that proving who sent it would would be nearly impossible. I spent the rest of that day trying to find a lawyer who would take my case pro bono. Most firms wouldn't even return my calls once they heard Buster's name. One attorney's assistant whispered that her boss had already been contacted by Buster's team with warnings about taking on frivolous cases. Jennifer called me that evening from a payphone. She'd been discharged from the hospital but had nowhere safe to go. Her parents had arranged for her to stay at a treatment facility that Buster had connections to. She was terrified but felt she had no choice. I scrambled to find alternatives, calling every shelter and safe house in a 3-county radius. Finally, a domestic violence shelter agreed to take her temporarily, even though her situation didn't fit their usual criteria. I drove her there myself, taking a circuitous route to make sure we weren't followed. The shelter director, a woman named Maria, had her own history with powerful men who thought they were untouchable. She promised to keep Jennifer safe. 2 days passed in a blur of job applications and evidence organization. I'd started a detailed timeline of everything that had happened, cross-referencing dates with the clinic's records I'd managed to copy before my suspension. Patterns emerged that made my skin crawl. Buster had been escalating his behavior over the years, becoming bolder as he realized the system would protect him. The investigator called with troubling news. One of the other victims who'd come forward had suddenly recanted her statement. She claimed she'd been confused, that she'd misinterpreted Buster's therapeutic techniques. Her new statement sounded rehearsed, like someone else's words in her mouth. I decided to visit Kelsey, the first victim I'd identified. She lived in a rundown apartment complex on the edge of town. When she opened the door, I barely recognized her. She'd lost weight, her eyes hollow and darting. She let me in reluctantly, checking the hallway before closing the door. Kelsey showed me a box full of items from her time with Buster. Cards he'd written professing his feelings, gifts that crossed professional boundaries, photos from a conference he'd taken her to, presenting her as his research assistant when she was really there as his victim. She'd kept everything, unable to throw it away but also unable to look at it. She wanted to help but was terrified. Buster had called her the day after his arrest, somehow getting her new number. He'd reminded her of all the ways he could destroy her credibility, her diagnosis, her history of self-harm, the fact that she'd pursued him initially. All of it could be twisted to make her look like the predator. I spent hours with Kelsey, documenting her evidence and recording her story with her permission. She cried through most of it, years of manipulation and gaslighting finally being acknowledged. By the time I left, she'd agreed to submit her evidence to the investigation, though she wasn't sure she could testify in person. The next morning brought another setback. The clinic had filed a countersuit against me for theft of proprietary information and breach of contract. They claimed I'd stolen patient files and violated HIPAA regulations. The irony of them citing patient privacy while protecting a predator wasn't lost on me. I met with a legal aid attorney who reviewed my situation. She was honest about my chances. Without significant financial resources, fighting both Buster's defamation suit and the clinic's countersuit would be nearly impossible. She suggested I consider settling, maybe agreeing to a non-disclosure agreement in exchange for dropping the charges. The thought made me physically ill. How many others had been silenced this way? How many victims had chosen survival over justice because the system made fighting back impossible? Jennifer called from the shelter that night. She'd received a letter from her family's attorney. Her parents were threatening to pursue conservatorship if she continued with her delusions about Buster. Rachel needing her divorce settlement over justice is the kind of impossible choice that makes you want to scream at the ceiling. Survival versus truth shouldn't be a multiple choice test with no right answer. They'd included a psychiatric evaluation form, already partially filled out by a doctor she'd never met. I researched conservatorship laws until my eyes burned. The requirements were strict, but with enough pressure and the right connections, it could be done. Jennifer's history of mental health struggles would be used against her, just as Buster had always threatened. The state board investigator reached out with a glimmer of hope. She'd found discrepancies in Buster's licensing renewal applications. He'd failed to disclose a previous complaint from another state where he'd practiced briefly. It had been sealed, but she was working on getting access. It wasn't much, but it was something. I decided to reach out to former employees of the clinic. Maybe someone else had seen things, stayed quiet out of fear. I found contact information for a receptionist who'd left abruptly 2 years ago. When I called, she hung up as soon as I mentioned the clinic. But an hour later, she called back from a different number. We met at a truck stop 40 miles outside of town. She was nervous, constantly checking over her shoulder. She told me she'd seen things, heard things, patients leaving Buster's office in distress, scheduling irregularities. She'd tried to report it to Dr. Chen, but was told to mind her own business. When she persisted, she was let go with a severance package that included a strict non-disclosure agreement. She couldn't testify or provide official evidence without losing her house, which she'd bought with the severance money, but she gave me names of other former employees who might talk. She also mentioned that Buster had a storage unit across town where he kept old files. She'd seen him there once when she was visiting her own unit. I drove by the storage facility that night. It was a massive complex with hundreds of units. Without knowing which one was Buster's, there was no legal way to search, but I made note of the location, adding it to my growing file of information. Rachel reached out again through our mutual contact. Her ex-husband had suddenly withdrawn his generous divorce offer after learning she was still considering testifying. Now he was fighting for full custody of their children, citing her mental health history and recent hospitalization. The timing was too convenient to be coincidental. I met with her at a coffee shop where she broke down completely. She couldn't lose her kids. They were everything to her. She apologized over and over, but I understood. The system wasn't just failing victims. It was actively punishing them for speaking up. The investigator called with bad news. The emergency motion to seal evidence had been partially granted. While victim testimonies could still be used in the licensing board investigation, they would be heavily restricted in any public proceedings. Buster's team was also pushing for the investigation to be conducted entirely behind closed doors, citing the potential damage to his reputation. I spent that night organizing everything I had. 11 victims over 8 years, but only 3 willing to testify. Mountains of circumstantial evidence, but little that would be considered definitive proof. The hidden files I'd found were my strongest evidence, but Buster's lawyers were already claiming they were fabricated. My friend whose apartment I'd been staying at asked me to leave. She'd started getting hang-up calls at work. Her boss had questioned her about her associations. She felt terrible, but she couldn't risk her job. I understood, but felt the walls closing in. I found a cheap motel on the highway that accepted cash. The room smelled like cigarettes and despair, but it was safe for now. I spread all my evidence across the bed, looking for patterns I might have missed, connections that could strengthen the case. The clinic announced that Dr. Buster would be returning to practice on a limited basis while the investigation continued. They cited the presumption of innocence and the need to serve their patients. Several of his former victims were still patients there, now assigned to other therapists who'd made their loyalty to Buster clear. Jennifer called in a panic. Someone had found the shelter's address and sent flowers again. This time the card said she looked beautiful at her therapy appointment yesterday. The shelter was moving her to a different location, but she was falling apart. The constant fear was undoing all the progress she'd made. I reached out to the other 2 victims who'd agreed to testify. One was holding steady, determined to see it through. The other was wavering. Her employer had started asking questions about her mental health history. She'd been passed over for a promotion she'd been guaranteed. The pressure was subtle but effective. The investigator arranged for us to meet with the full board for preliminary testimony. It would be closed door, just the board members and a court reporter. Buster wouldn't be present, but his lawyers would. The thought of facing them, having every word scrutinized and twisted, was terrifying even for me. I spent the days before the hearing preparing Jennifer and the other victims. We went over their stories again and again, not to rehearse but to help them feel confident in their truth. Buster's lawyers would try to confuse them, make them doubt their own experiences. They needed to be ready. The morning of the hearing, I woke up to find my car vandalized. Nothing that couldn't be explained as random mischief, but the timing was suspect. All 4 tires slashed, windows smashed. The motel manager said their cameras didn't cover that section of the parking lot. I took a rideshare to the hearing, my evidence boxes balanced on my lap. The driver made small talk about the weather while I tried to calm my racing heart. This was it, our chance to make the board understand what Buster really was. The hearing room was smaller than I'd expected. Wood paneling and fluorescent lights that made everyone look sick. The board members sat behind a long table, their faces carefully neutral. Buster's legal team took up one entire side of the room, expensive suits and predatory smiles. Jennifer testified first. Her voice shook, but she didn't waver. She described the grooming process, how Buster had slowly broken down her boundaries, how he'd used her trauma against her, convincing her that he was the only one who truly understood her pain. The lawyers interrupted constantly with objections and clarifications, but she persisted. When she described the pregnancy and miscarriage, one of the board members actually looked uncomfortable, but Buster's lead attorney immediately questioned whether she could prove the pregnancy was his, whether the miscarriage was natural. They painted her as unstable, manipulative, desperate for attention. The second victim's testimony was equally harrowing. She'd kept a journal during her time as Buster's patient, documenting the progression from therapist to predator. The lawyers questioned the authenticity of the journal, suggested she'd written it recently to support her claims. When it was my turn to present evidence, I laid out everything methodically. The billing discrepancies, the scheduling patterns, the hidden files. I showed them Buster's own notes about targeting vulnerable women. The board members took notes, asked clarifying questions, but their faces remained unreadable. Buster's lawyers attacked my credibility relentlessly. They brought up my own therapy history, suggested I had a hero complex. They painted me as a disgruntled employee who'd been rightfully terminated for poor performance. Every piece of evidence was questioned, every motive scrutinized. The hearing lasted 6 hours. By the end, I felt hollowed out. Jennifer was shaking, tears streaming down her face. The other victim had gone completely silent, staring at the floor. We'd given everything we had, but would it be enough? The investigator walked us out, whispering that we'd done well, but I could see the doubt in her eyes. She'd seen too many of these cases go nowhere. Too many predators protected by systems designed to maintain the status quo. Outside, Buster was waiting by a black sedan. He didn't approach, didn't speak, just stood there, watching us leave. His message was clear. He wasn't going anywhere. That night, I sat in my motel room staring at my phone. 3 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. 2 emails from potential employers withdrawing their interest. 1 text from Jennifer saying she didn't think she could do this anymore. But there was also a message from Maria at the shelter. Another woman had come forward, someone who'd seen our story on a victims advocacy forum. She'd been Buster's patient 5 years ago, had never told anyone what happened. She wanted to help. I called her immediately. Her name was Sarah, and her story was devastatingly familiar. The late night sessions, the boundary violations, the threats when she tried to end it. She'd moved 3 states away to escape, but had never stopped looking over her shoulder. Sarah had something we didn't. Photos Buster had taken during their relationship. Nothing explicit, but clearly inappropriate for a therapist-patient dynamic. She'd also kept voicemails where he'd threatened to have her committed if she left him. The investigation was entering a critical phase. The board would deliberate for weeks, possibly months. Buster's lawyers would file motion after motion to delay and obstruct, but momentum was building. More victims were finding courage in our stories. I found a job at a grocery store stocking shelves overnight. It wasn't therapy, but it paid enough for the motel and ramen noodles. My former life felt like a dream, something that had happened to someone else, but I couldn't give up now. Too many people were counting on me. Jennifer had stabilized at the new shelter location. She'd started attending group therapy with other survivors, finding strength in shared experience. Buster's lawyers questioning whether Jennifer could prove the pregnancy was his strikes me as particularly calculated. They're not denying it happened, just muddying the waters enough to create doubt about something deeply personal and painful. She still had bad days when Buster's voice echoed in her head telling her she was worthless, but she was fighting back. The investigator called with updates when she could. The board was taking the allegations seriously, but Buster's team was mounting an aggressive defense. They'd hired expert witnesses to testify about false memory syndrome and transference. They were building a narrative where Buster was the victim. I connected Sarah with the investigator, helped her prepare her evidence for submission. Her photos and voicemails were damning, but Buster's lawyers would find ways to explain them away. They always did. 2 months into the investigation, cracks began to show in Buster's defense. The sealed complaint from the other state had finally been accessed. Another woman, another pattern of abuse. The board couldn't ignore the emerging pattern, but Buster wasn't going down without a fight. My motel room was broken into while I was at work. Nothing stolen, but everything disturbed. A message that nowhere was safe. The police took a report but said without evidence of who did it, there was nothing they could do. I started carrying copies of all crucial evidence with me at all times. USB drives in my pockets, cloud backups accessed from library computers. I'd become paranoid, but justifiably so. Every shadow could be a threat, every stranger a spy. The clinic announced they were conducting their own internal investigation. Dr. Chen would be leading it, the woman who'd laughed at Jennifer's pain. It was a farce, but it gave them cover to claim they were taking the allegations seriously. More victims emerged from the shadows. Not all were willing to testify officially, but their stories added weight to our claims. Buster had been a predator for over a decade, protected by a system that valued reputation over safety. The financial pressure was crushing. The grocery store cut my hours without explanation. Applications to other jobs went went unanswered. My credit cards maxed out from legal fees and basic survival. But every time I considered giving up, I thought of Jennifer, of Kelsey, of all the women still trapped in silence. 3 months in, the board reached a preliminary decision. They found sufficient evidence to proceed with formal charges against Buster's license. It wasn't victory, but it was progress. The real battle was just beginning. Buster's response was swift and vicious. The defamation lawsuit was amended to include new claims. The dollar amount doubled. His lawyers sent settlement offers with non-disclosure agreements so restrictive they would essentially erase everything that had happened. Jennifer remained strong. The shelter had connected her with pro bono legal services to fight her parents' conservatorship attempt. She was attending community college online, rebuilding her life piece by piece. Her testimony had been crucial, and she knew it. The formal hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks out. It would be public this time, media allowed. Buster's team fought to keep it closed, but the board ruled that transparency was necessary given the serious nature of the allegations. I prepared for the onslaught that would come. My name would be in the papers, my history exposed, everything I'd worked for professionally destroyed. But silence was no longer an option. Too many women had been silenced already. The investigator warned me that Buster's team would get dirtier as the hearing approached. They'd already hired a private investigator to dig into my past, looking for anything to discredit me. She suggested I prepare for the worst. I moved out of the motel into a friend's basement, someone from my old life who still believed in doing the right thing. It was safer than the motel, and cheaper. I needed every penny for the legal battle ahead. Sarah flew in to meet with the investigator in person. Seeing her was powerful. She'd rebuilt her life, had a career and family now, but the scars were still there. She was proof that survival was possible, but also that the trauma never fully disappeared. 2 weeks before the hearing, another blow. The receptionist who'd met me at the truck stop called in tears. She'd been subpoenaed by Buster's lawyers. If she testified, she'd have to admit to violating her NDA. She'd lose everything. I told her to protect herself. We had enough evidence without destroying more lives, but it hurt to see another person crushed by the system protecting predators. The media picked up the story as the hearing date approached. Local news ran segments on the allegations. Buster's supporters flooded comment sections, calling us liars and attention seekers, but other voices emerged too. Women who'd had their own experiences with predatory therapists. Our story was resonating. Buster made a calculated move. He voluntarily suspended his practice pending the hearing outcome. His lawyers spun it as the action of an innocent man confident in vindication. The clinic praised his professionalism. I spent every free moment preparing, organizing evidence, practicing testimony, steeling myself for the public scrutiny. The grocery store manager pulled me aside to say corporate was uncomfortable with the media attention. My job was hanging by a thread. Jennifer, Sarah, and 2 other victims committed to testifying at the public hearing. Others would submit written statements. It wasn't the army I'd hoped for, but it was enough. It had to be. The investigator called with one final piece of information. She'd found evidence that Buster had done this before, at his previous practice. The woman who'd complained had been paid off, the record sealed. But patterns were patterns, and this one was becoming undeniable. 5 days before the hearing, I got a call that changed everything. A woman named Dr. Elizabeth Torrey, a therapist from Buster's previous practice. She'd been his colleague, had suspected something was wrong. When she'd tried to report it, she'd been pushed out. She'd been watching our case, waiting. Dr. Torrey had documentation, emails where Buster had discussed his special treatment methods, notes from staff meetings where concerns were raised and dismissed. She'd kept everything, knowing someday it might matter. Her credibility as a fellow professional would be huge. Buster's team couldn't paint her as a troubled patient or disgruntled employee. She was one of them, speaking out against one of their own. The pieces were falling into place. Not perfectly, not easily, but steadily. The hearing would be brutal. Buster would fight with everything he had. His reputation, his freedom, his ability to hurt others all hung in the balance. But we were ready. Battered, exhausted, traumatized, but ready. The truth had a way of surfacing, even when powerful people tried to bury it. And we had more than truth now. We had each other. The real fight was about to begin. The morning of the public hearing arrived with a cold drizzle that matched my mood. I dressed in my only remaining professional outfit, hands trembling as I buttoned the jacket. The friend whose basement I'd been staying in offered to drive me, but I needed the walk to clear my head. The state building loomed ahead, reporters already gathering on the steps. I kept my head down and pushed through, ignoring their shouted questions. Inside, the hearing room was packed. Victims' advocacy groups had mobilized their members. Local therapists who'd quietly supported us filled the back rows. Buster's supporters clustered on the opposite side, their hostile stares following my every move. Jennifer arrived with Maria from the shelter, both women flanking her protectively. She looked fragile but determined, clutching a folder of her own evidence. Sarah had flown in the night before, her husband by her side. The other victims sat together, drawing strength from proximity. Dr. Elizabeth Torrey entered last, her professional demeanor commanding respect. Several board members visibly straightened when they saw her. Buster's legal team huddled in urgent conference, clearly not expecting this development. Buster himself sat at the defense table, his usual charm replaced by cold calculation. He'd lost weight, his expensive suit hanging loose, but his eyes still held that predatory confidence, scanning the room like he owned it. The board chair called the hearing to order. Unlike the preliminary hearing, this one would follow formal procedures. Each side would present evidence, call witnesses, and make arguments. The board would then deliberate and issue their decision. Buster's team went first, painting him as a dedicated healer victimized by troubled patients and a vindictive former employee. They presented testimonials from colleagues, awards, and publications, years of supposedly exemplary service. Their expert witness testified about false memories and transference, using clinical language to obscure the truth. When our turn came, the investigator presented her findings methodically. Financial records, scheduling anomalies, the pattern of targeting vulnerable women. She'd done her homework, anticipating every objection and preparing counters. The board members took extensive notes. Jennifer testified with quiet strength. She described the grooming process, the escalating boundary violations, the threats when she tried to leave. She showed the text messages, explained the pregnancy and miscarriage. Buster's lawyers tried to shake her, but she held firm. Sarah's testimony was equally powerful. The photos she'd kept, the voicemails, the years of trauma she'd carried. Her husband sat in the gallery, tears streaming down his face as he learned details she'd never shared. The board members couldn't dismiss her as unstable or attention-seeking. Dr. Torrey's testimony shifted everything. She presented emails, meeting notes, documentation of concerns raised and dismissed. She described the culture of protection around Buster, how anyone who questioned him was pushed out. Dr. Torrey showing up with receipts from Buster's past workplace is the plot twist nobody ordered but everybody needed. Sometimes the best witness is the one who kept quiet long enough to collect all the the evidence first. Her credibility as a fellow professional gave weight to everything we'd been saying. Buster's team scrambled to respond. They attacked Dr. Tori's motivations, suggested she had professional jealousy. They questioned the authenticity of documents, implied conspiracy. But their arguments felt desperate now, grasping at straws. The lunch break was tense. Buster cornered me in the hallway, his lawyers mysteriously absent. He leaned close, his cologne overwhelming. His whispered words were careful, nothing overtly threatening, just observations about how hard it must be, living in fear, wondering what might happen next. Security intervened before I could respond. The afternoon session focused on the hidden files I'd found. Buster's team claimed they were fabricated, but forensic analysis confirmed their authenticity. 11 victims over 8 years. Detailed notes about vulnerabilities and exploitation. The board members' expressions grew increasingly grim. More victims testified via written statements. Women who couldn't be there in person but wanted their voices heard. Each story reinforced the pattern. Late-night sessions, boundary violations, threats, and manipulation. The sheer volume was overwhelming. Buster took a stand in his own defense. He was polished, professional, admitting to lapses in judgment while denying any criminal behavior. He painted himself as a healer who'd gotten too emotionally invested, who'd made mistakes but never intended harm. Some board members seemed swayed. The investigator's closing argument was brilliant. She laid out the evidence piece by piece, showing how each element supported the pattern of predatory behavior. She reminded the board of their duty to protect the public, not prominent practitioners. She asked them to imagine their own daughters, sisters, friends in those late-night sessions. Buster's team made their final plea, invoking his years of service, his contributions to the field. They asked the board to consider the destruction of a brilliant career over what they called misunderstandings and false memories. They painted us as a mob bent on destroying an innocent man. The board retired to deliberate. We waited in the hallway, victims and supporters mingling uneasily. Jennifer stayed close to Maria, jumping at every sound. Sarah paced endlessly, her husband trying to calm her. I sat alone, exhausted beyond words. 3 hours later, they called us back. The board chair's expression was unreadable as she began delivering the decision. They'd found clear and convincing evidence of multiple boundary violations, intimacy exploitation of patients, and conduct unbecoming a licensed therapist. Buster's license was revoked permanently. The room erupted. Victims sobbed with relief. Advocates cheered. Buster's supporters shouted about injustice and witch hunts. Buster himself sat frozen, his face a mask of disbelief slowly morphing into rage. But it wasn't over. The board referred their findings to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. The investigator had already been coordinating with law enforcement. As we filed out of the hearing room, police officers were waiting. They arrested Buster on multiple counts of intimacy assault and abuse of position. The clinic's board of directors held an emergency meeting that night. By morning, Dr. Chen had been placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The clinic announced a comprehensive review of policies and procedures. Several other therapists quietly submitted resignations. Jennifer called me from the shelter, crying with relief and fear. The victory felt hollow when she still couldn't go home, when her parents still believed Buster over her. But Maria assured her this was just the beginning of healing. Real recovery would take time. Sarah flew home the next day, finally able to tell her full story to her family. She'd carried the secret for so long, it had poisoned parts of her life she hadn't even realized. Her husband sent me a message later, thanking me for helping her find closure. The other victims began their own journeys. Some sought therapy with carefully vetted practitioners. Others joined support groups. A few wanted nothing more to do with the mental health system. Each path was valid, each woman finding her own way forward. Buster's criminal trial would take months to begin. His expensive lawyers would use every trick to delay and obstruct, but the prosecutor was confident. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern undeniable. Justice might be slow, but it was coming. The grocery store manager called me into his office. I expected termination, but instead he offered me full-time hours. He'd followed the case, had a daughter in therapy. He understood why I'd fought so hard. It wasn't my career, but it was income, stability, a chance to rebuild. I found a small apartment, nothing fancy but mine. The first night there, I spread all the evidence across the floor one last time. Then I packed it away, ready to hand over to prosecutors. The investigation was over. The healing could begin. Dr. Tori reached out about a position at a new clinic she was opening, one with transparent policies and real accountability. She wanted someone who understood the importance of protecting vulnerable patients. I told her I'd think about it. Maybe someday I'd be ready to practice again. The district attorney's office assigned a victim advocate to work with all of Buster's victims. She helped navigate the criminal justice system, prepared them for what was coming. Some chose to testify at trial, others provided statements. All were heard. Kelsey finally felt safe enough to meet with me in person. We sat in a coffee shop, two survivors of different kinds comparing scars. She'd started therapy with someone Dr. Tori recommended, was slowly reclaiming her life. She thanked me for believing her when no one else would. Buster's assets were frozen pending civil lawsuits. His house went on the market. His children changed schools to escape the shame. His wife filed for divorce. The man who'd seemed untouchable was losing everything, but it could never undo the damage he'd caused. The state therapy board announced new regulations requiring additional oversight for therapists treating vulnerable populations. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Future predators would find it harder to operate in shadows. Jennifer's parents finally agreed to family counseling. The therapist helped them understand how Buster had manipulated everyone, not just his victims. Slowly, painfully, they began rebuilding their relationship. Jennifer moved into transitional housing, taking online classes, planning a future. Local news coverage died down as other stories took precedence. Buster's supporters drifted away, unwilling to defend him as evidence mounted. The clinic struggled to rebuild its reputation. Several patients transferred elsewhere, unwilling to trust an institution that had protected a predator. I returned to the storage facility one night with the prosecutor and a warrant. We found Buster's unit filled with boxes of patient files he shouldn't have kept. More evidence of his crimes, more victims to notify. The scope kept expanding, but at least now it was in proper hands. Rachel testified at a pre-trial hearing, her voice strong despite her ex-husband's presence. She'd lost her custody battle, but gained something more important, her voice. She spoke truth in a system designed to silence victims. The judge listened, really listened. 6 months after the hearing, Buster pled guilty to multiple counts rather than face trial. The evidence was too overwhelming, the victims too credible. He received 8 years in prison, lifetime registration as an intimacy offender, and could never practice therapy again. It wasn't enough, but it was something. The morning after his sentencing, I stood outside the courthouse watching the sunrise. Jennifer stood beside me, along with Sarah, Kelsey, and 3 other victims who'd found courage to come forward. We didn't speak, just stood together, survivors of a system that had failed us, but ultimately couldn't silence us. I started working with the victim advocate, sharing my experience with others facing similar situations. Not as a therapist, but as someone who'd been there. Someone who understood the cost of speaking truth to power. Someone who knew that healing wasn't linear, but was possible. The clinic eventually closed, unable to recover from the scandal. Dr. Chen lost her license after investigation revealed she'd known about complaints for years. Other therapists faced sanctions. The building stood empty, a monument to institutional failure. Jennifer enrolled in college, studying social work. She wanted to help others who'd been silenced and dismissed. Her parents supported her now. Their relationship forever changed, but slowly healing. She still had hard days, but more good ones were coming. Dr. Tori's new clinic opened with policies that prioritized patient safety over practitioner protection. She hired therapists who understood boundaries, who saw their role as healers, not predators. She offered me a position again. This time, I was ready to accept. My first day back in practice was terrifying, but my first patient was a young woman with trauma history, referred by the victim advocate. As she told her story, I remembered why I'd become a therapist. Not for prestige or power, but to help people heal. Buster had tried to destroy that, but he'd failed. The financial lawsuits settled quietly. Victims received compensation that could never truly compensate, but it helped with therapy costs, education, fresh starts. Buster's malpractice insurance fought every claim, but eventually paid. Money couldn't buy back innocence, but it could fund futures. A year later, Jennifer graduated from her program with honors. I attended the ceremony, watching her walk across the stage with confidence Buster had tried to steal. Her parents were there, proud and humbled. Maria from the shelter wiped away tears. We'd all come so far. I kept a photo on my desk at the new clinic, not of Buster or the trial, but of the sunrise outside the courthouse. A reminder that darkness ends, that truth matters, that speaking up can change things. Not easily, not quickly, but genuinely. Some nights I still woke up anxious, remembering the fear and isolation. But then I'd think of Jennifer in school, Sarah with her family, Kelsey in recovery. We'd survived. More than that, we'd fought back. And in the end, that made all the difference. Thanks for reading this story with me. I hope you have a wonderful day. I will see you in the next one.